Hey, good morning, everyone. My name's Ann Reynolds. I'm with the Alliance for Clean Energy of New York. Just 30 seconds on what ACE New York is, for those of you that might not know. We are a membership-based organization. Our members are renewable energy and energy efficiency companies. So we're essentially a trade association for the renewable and efficiency industry in New York State. I have member companies that are engaged in land-based wind development, large-scale, smaller-scale distributed wind, distributed solar, utility-scale solar, or they're interested in getting into utility-scale solar, offshore wind, fuel cells, hydropower, biomass, biogas, and energy efficiency. We also, at ACE, under our bylaws, half of our board is made up of representatives from nonprofit organizations, so we do have Natural Resources Defense Council, Sierra Club, and environmental advocates, for example, on our board as well. So that's the list of all the people that I have to try to make happy all the time, and it never works. But we are actually extremely happy about New York's 50% clean energy standard. As you can imagine, this was our goal, to have a really clear commitment in New York State to clean energy, and we have achieved that. But my next slide is here to present something you know already, but to illustrate what John was saying in terms of how ambitious this goal is. So I want to leave you with the message that we are not on an easy glide path to 50%. It's something that will only be achieved if a lot of moving parts end up in the right place. So we have, as John mentioned, about 25% of our electricity comes from renewable energy now, the overwhelming majority of that, which is the NYPA hydro projects. Just 3% wind, as an example, and states like Kansas and Iowa have about 30% of their electricity coming from wind now. So New York has a long way to go, and there's a lot of potential there. This is a breakdown of that 25%. So 12% of that is wind, 9% is other renewables. I do want to point out, too, that that other hydro piece of the pie it's not all the hydro, it's NYPA, and there is privately owned hydro operating and imported into New York. So just to say again something that John said, 10 years of the renewable energy portfolio standard, we went from about 19% to about 25% or 26%. We've got 14 years now to go from 25% to 50%. So clearly it will require a great acceleration of development if we're going to get close to that goal and achieve that goal. We need to not just get new projects built, though. This is, as John said, the priority for the Clean Energy Standard. It's also the priority for ACE in some ways, at least our developer members. But we're not going to get to 50% unless we keep the renewable energy that we have now operating in New York. And that means not closing down because of economic reasons. It also means not exporting their RECs into Massachusetts, which is something that is happening now and will probably happen increasingly as the REC prices are higher in New England. We also, when the Commission calculated how many new renewables we needed in order to get to 50%, they made some assumptions. They assumed that we would get the 3 gigawatts of solar that New York Sun is working towards. And our members are also engaged in distributed renewables, so that's an important piece of the puzzle. And it also assumed some aggressive energy efficiency, roughly 1.3% per year electricity savings, which is well above what New York is getting now. So I'll say that again. It assumed an amount of energy efficiency that is almost equal to the entire piece of the pie for new renewables. And unless we get that energy efficiency, we're not going to get to 50%. There's good news there, though. There's 110,000 people in New York working in energy efficiency right now. If we increase our commitment to energy efficiency in order to meet this goal, we're talking about real clean energy jobs in New York that cannot be outsourced. There's also, I should mention, about now 44,000 renewable energy jobs in New York. Those are people that are employed by our member companies. And those numbers that I just said came from the Department of Energy's jobs report that came out, I think, about 5 minutes before President Trump was inaugurated. Just got that out under the wire. But there's new information from NYSERDA from Friday that was released at the governor's Climate Jobs Summit. but I was busy, dressing my children for Halloween and haven't had a chance to memorize those numbers yet, but that information was just released on Friday. In terms of the new grid scale projects getting built, I'll be referring to that as Tier 1, and these are the technologies that we expect will contribute to that. And I think it's important to note that we can't say that we're going to get that all from solar or all from land-based wind, or we're going to depend on offshore wind to get us to the 50%, because it's really going to take all those technologies in order to get there. It's 29 million megawatt hours that we're going to need for that Tier 1 over the next 14 years. And from the point of view of developers, what do they need to get projects built? First and foremost, and the foundation of the Clean Energy Standard, again, from our perspective, is long-term contracts. And it is, there's a lot of details associated with the obligation of utilities and ESCOs to buy RECs. And all of that is extremely important to how the Clean Energy Standard functions. But from the point of view of a wind or solar developer, they're looking at the NYSERDA contracting schedule as their reason for being. It's those long-term REC contracts. And they were equally enthusiastic about the open solicitation that the New York Power Authority has, and I think they'll be making their decision on that too. NYPA is also offering the possibility of a REC contract, or the possibility of a power purchase agreement that's prepaid, or where the developer continues to own the resource. Or another option is that the ownership of that after a certain number of years would transfer over to NYPA. So that was a really innovative request for proposals that NYPA has out right now, with some decisions due relatively soon on that. And the development community is really looking to those two open solicitations to find out, well, who will win, basically, who will get those contracts in this first round, and how this program will shape up in the coming years. But this is my point about the glide path. You can have a long-term REC contract, and you still need a lot of pieces to fall into place before a project actually gets built and starts operating. You need, for example, to go through the Article 10 project or through seeker if you're less than 20 megawatts. And as was mentioned, there's a whole batch of projects in the Article 10 process now. And I think there will be more, in the coming year as developers continue to express interest in the New York market. There should be more Article 10 projects, and there is a growing list of utility-scale solar projects that will be going through the seeker project if they move ahead. But that's not your only problem. If you're a developer, you also need to get an interconnection agreement from the ISO, and that interconnection process is its own complex and expensive process that needs to happen on a parallel track with Article 10. Our members identified the length and complexity of the interconnection process as something they wanted ACE to work on, which we did, working with the ISO to try to encourage some improvements to that process. And I did earlier see Sarah Keegan in the audience. She's the one at the ISO who did all the legal work associated with getting that package of improvements to FERC. And all the improvements, from our perspective, are designed to help make the process more efficient, less expensive, and to interact better with the Article 10 process, not to shortchange any reliability reviews or other safety reviews. And all of those improvements, should they come to pass, are technology neutral. They're not just for renewables. So you're welcome, Gavin, on that. Say you have an interconnection agreement and you have your Article 10 process and you have a long-term contract, your work still isn't done because there is still various local agreements that have to happen. They can be road crossing agreements, and they certainly include taxation agreements, the pilots. I wanted to mention a bit about transmission. We are increasingly seeing transmission as a clean energy issue. Not because more grid-scale renewables can't be built now with the current transmission system, because they can, but we do feel that New York State should study how transmission investments would make the 50% renewables most cost effectively achieved. And that includes both how do we move power from windy upstate areas to downstate, and how do we move offshore wind power to shore. There is a public policy transmission needs process. Probably many of you have been involved in that. In our view, the Western New York process, which is pretty far along and a project has been selected, and the AC transmission needs for the Hudson Valley need to progress and be finalized. But there also is a new public policy transmission process that was started in 2016. There hasn't been a lot of action on it lately. There may be inside DPS, and I said that I don't know about, but we're hoping that not only would that effort be accelerated and identify achievement of the clean energy standard as a public policy need, but there'd be a way to include facilitation of renewables and carbon emissions in the selection process for those transmission projects. So in terms of getting to 50%, the Commission did a cost study before the order was finalized, and you don't really need to pay too much attention to all these numbers, but it essentially illustrates that it would take all of these technologies to get there, and under the scenario that they analyzed, and this would have been the early summer 2016, land-based wind would have been making up about half of the new renewables that we would need. And utility scale solar, of which there's a couple projects on Long Island, but essentially no grid scale solar in New York State yet, upstate. So this would be a significant new market under this potential scenario. But this was based on their assessment of cost curves, and actually how it will happen will depend on how these projects compete with each other for the contracts that John was talking about. And the governor's commitment to offshore wind, the 2,400 megawatts by 2030, was made after this analysis was done. This chart shows, this is just us at ACE thinking about what different factors would shift how many renewables will get built, different scenarios. I will say that the correct way to do that would be to make these different assumptions and then to examine the cost curves and see which types of projects would be least cost. That's not the way I did it, because I don't have access to the cost curves. We just reduced the other technologies proportionally. But it's just meant to indicate the scale of renewable energy development we would need and the types of technologies that you might be seeing. And that some of the companies that are members of ACE and potential clients of you, the types of projects that they would be pursuing. So the first scenario is the one that DPS did. The second one is if you add in 2,400 megawatts of offshore wind and reduce the other technologies proportionally. And so as you can see here, offshore wind would make up a bigger percentage of what we would need. There's also, of course, been conversation about importing additional hydro from Canada, and this third scenario puts in 1,000 megawatts of hydro imports. How would that change things? And the fourth scenario just says, what if we added additional distributed renewables? So we were more successful than the state is predicting with New York Sun, and we get an additional 1,000 megawatts of distributed solar, and then how would that change things? The basic message of all these numbers is under any of these scenarios, we need a lot of everything. So it's a pretty simple message. I will skip past these because sometimes when I'm talking to people, they need to get a visual of how many turbines that means, or how many offshore turbines. And this is one, in scenario 4, for example, you'd get about 2,600 megawatts of land-based wind, which takes up a good amount of land. It's still 0.75% of all the land in New York State. So I think that's important to keep in perspective. That same scenario calls for over 2,000 megawatts of grid-scale solar. A lot of land, yes, but still very small compared to the land base of New York State. And this compares the wind and solar, how much land is required for each. Obviously, wind has a smaller direct land use footprint, and you can have agriculture operating around wind, but solar has a smaller total project land use footstep. And I think what we're going to be seeing in the coming years is how can solar be integrated with agricultural operations in New York State too. So right after the governor announced 50%, guess that was December 2015, the projects proposed in the ISOQ started increasing. There's now 33 wind projects in the queue, totaling 4,500 megawatts, and 51 solar projects. This includes the South Fork offshore wind project, so there's one offshore wind project in there. If history is a guide, and I think it's important to say this, not nearly all of these projects will get built. It's going to depend on who gets long-term contracts, either from NYSERDA, NYPA, or other places. Some projects drop out of the queue because the companies merge with someone else. They decide they're only developing wind in Indiana. There's a lot of changes that can happen. But I think the important message from the number of projects in the queue is that there's more than enough opportunity, potential opportunity, not just technical potential, but real places to build projects. We don't know exactly where those projects will be, but there's a lot of potential. And I think the other thing it tells us, interestingly enough, is because most of these solar projects, although not all, are 20 megawatts, which is the limit for Article 10. So the solar companies are making some decisions that they feel it would be best for them to go through seeker rather than Article 10. I think that's a telling piece of information. We at ACE are concerned about the pace of the Article 10 process. I think I feel for my comrades at DPS because there's a group of projects there now and more coming their way. And at the pace since Article 10 law went into effect in 2012 is not going to be enough to get us to feed into the procurements that NYSERDA is doing. So I think I'm just reiterating from the developer's point of view, the long-term contract is foundational, but all those other pieces are important too. We at ACE, we're not advocating for any changes to the Article 10 law or the Article 10 regulations, and we don't see the need to back off on any environmental review requirements in New York State. But we do hope that the process can go expeditiously and fairly in order to get us where we want to be.